Good evening, everyone. It is a very great pleasure to welcome you to the Memorial Church for the beginning of a year-long conversation with the Reverend Dr. Raphael G. Warnock, one of the most significant voices on religion and public life in the United States. The William Belden Noble Lectures were established in 1898 by Nanny Yulee Noble in memory of her husband. Inspired by Jesus' words in the Gospel of John that I came that they may have life and have it abundantly, Mrs. Noble hoped that these lectures would deepen our understanding of these words and enable us to live more deeply, more compassionately, more abundantly. Our speaker this evening has dedicated his life and work to helping that abundant life take root in this struggling world and to resist the ideologies and cruelties that would diminish it. This is the first of 4 lectures that Reverend Warnock will be giving on our campus this year. We hope to welcome you back to the Memorial Church for the next one on Wednesday, November 20th. Reverend Warnock is the lead pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, the 5th pastor in a line of great ministers, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is a graduate of Morehouse College and of Union Theological Seminary in New York, where he received his MDiv and his PhD studying with the great James Cone. He is also an alumnus of the Summer Leadership Program directed by our own Professor Preston Williams at Harvard Divinity School. A national voice on social justice issues such as voting rights and criminal justice, Reverend Warnock's work has been featured on CNN, the CBS Evening News, the Huffington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. A career working at the intersection of scholarship, ministry, and activism has given shape to a ministry marked by spiritual depth and social witness. His first book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, published by New York University Press in 2014, is centered around these commitments. In it, he argues for a prophetic church in which piety and liberation are deeply intertwined, a church that is, as he puts it, rigorously and lovingly challenged by both its theologians and its pastors. He is a model of the learned ministry that Harvard was founded to educate, a minister who knows how to learn in many contexts and who is able to bring what he learns in one to bear on another. Tonight, he is here to bring his learning, his scholarship, his piety, his pastoral imagination to bear on one of the most urgent issues facing our country, the scandal of mass incarceration and the devastation it has wrought, especially in Black and brown communities in this country. Following the lecture, Reverend Warnock will continue in conversation with us and with Dr. Kaya Stern, director of the Prison Studies Project at Harvard and a visiting faculty member in the School of Education, where she leads the Transformative Justice Program. We are delighted to have her and her students in her course, From Plantations to Prison, Justice, Punishment, and Learning, with us this evening. Following the lecture and the Q&A, there will be a reception in the memorial room, which is just off a little bit off the middle aisle to the left, and we look forward to greeting you there. For now, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, you invited a Baptist preacher from the South. You have to talk back to me. Good evening, Harvard.
Good evening.
I am grateful to be here, deeply honored by this invitation. I want to thank Professor Stephanie Paulsell, interim dean here at the Harvard Church, for a very kind and generous introduction, for her hospitality and the hospitality of all the staff here, including the Reverend Alana Sullivan and Professor Kaya Stern, who will lead our conversation following the lecture tonight. I'm grateful to see Professor Preston Williams, who led us a few summers ago when I was in the Summer Leadership Institute here at Harvard, and to my good friend and brother, the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Walton, who invited me to deliver the Noble Lectures, and shortly after I committed to doing it, he left the school and got out of town. I don't quite know how to take that. But he is a friend. Harvard is a school with some history and some tradition. But there are those of us who hail from a place called Morehouse College. Morehouse men are very proud. They say you can always tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much. Jonathan Walton is a part of that tradition, and so is Ron Sullivan at the Harvard Law School, with whom I had breakfast this morning as he leads a breakfast conversation. I understand that the Reverend Brandon Crowley was to be here tonight. I don't see him, but maybe he and his congregation at the Myrtle Street Baptist Church are on their way. My thanks to President Bacow and the Dean of Harvard Divinity School, David Hampton. I want to talk tonight from the subject, Let My People Go, the scandal of mass incarceration in the land of the free. The book of Exodus, so central to African American faith, chapter 8, verse 1 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go so that they may worship me." In the spring of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. took his last stand for freedom. In a very real sense, he was summoned to Memphis by the sacrifice of two sanitation workers, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, who were literally crushed to death in the back of a trash truck where they sought shelter from a storm. They were there because sanitation workers, black sanitation workers, were prohibited from riding in the truck with their white counterparts. Viewed as disposable refuse, they could only ride on the back of the truck or in the compactor area. So the black bodies of Echo Cole and Robert Walker were crushed and killed by the vicious machinery of Jim Crow segregation. We should observe that this was 4 years after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Law, and 3 years after the Voting Rights Law of 1965, the key legislative victories of the movement. Yet tragically, it was these crushed black bodies the latest blow in a long pattern of neglect and abuse that finally gave fuel to the fledgling Memphis movement, triggering the radical spirit and action of the local black churches and producing those historic and iconic signs, "I am a man." It is a distinctive sign of the oppressed that they must organize movements and carry out campaigns to affirm about themselves what ought to be obvious and secure for themselves what ought to be automatic, said these sanitation workers whose hard yet noble labor secured human dignity for everyone. I am a man. Negotiating the intersectionality of racial and gender oppression in the 19th century, Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" Similarly, activists resisting police brutality and the deadly encounters between law enforcement officers and unarmed citizens as consequences of mass incarceration declare Black Lives Matter. Those who retort, "No, all lives matter," manifestly miss the point. It is oppression itself that makes necessary movements to affirm the truth of what ought to be obvious. Likewise, it is privilege itself that renders one blind to the obvious contradictions to that truth. One of the biggest obstacles to genuine human community is a glib, unreflective, and uncritical universalism. Justice demands the recognition that all lives are not imperiled in the same ways. That is why a weary but committed Martin Luther King Jr. made his way to Memphis. He was there to stand with those who needed a movement, carrying signs bearing an inscription that was at once simple, sublime, and scandalous. "I am a man." A little over 2 months later, he would be slain by an assassin's bullet on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. His last book, published a year earlier, was entitled "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" I ask tonight, where indeed? Specifically, more than half a century after Memphis and the Poor People's Campaign, where are the places that poor bodies and Black bodies are being crushed by the machinery of the state or the society at large, demanding the attention of the church and the larger faith community? While recognizing the structural complexity of racism and its inextricable link to and participation with other constituent parts of hegemonic power, including sexism, classism, and militarism, I would argue that today mass incarceration is Jim Crow's most obvious descendant, and like its ancestor, its dismantling would represent both massive social and infrastructural transformation and immeasurable transvaluative power in a society still steeped in the ideology of white supremacy. The ideology of white supremacy has created the massive infrastructure of the American carceral state. I argue that this massive and increasingly privatized infrastructure has in turn constructed its own distinct ideology. And it is this ideology, the distorted fear-based logic of the carceral state, and its construal of Blackness as dangerousness and guilt, that imperils Black bodies during routine traffic stops. Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, while running in the rain through one's own gated community. 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, while playing in a public park. 12-year-old Tamir Rice, and while eating ice cream or playing video games with one's own family members in the sanctuary of one's own home. Botham Jean, a Tatiana Jefferson this week. Yet the deadly encounters between police or lawless vigilantes pretending to be police and black citizens so often in the headlines are as predictable as they are tragic. After all, they are but one manifestation of the massive infrastructure and insatiable appetite of a racialized carceral state. I submit that at root, this is a spiritual problem, symptomatic of a sickness in the body politic. Dr. King understood this. That is why when he, Joseph Lowery, who's still alive and with us, and others formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, the organizational arm of his prophetic witness, their motto was not merely, quote, to end segregation in America or to secure voting rights. Their motto was, quote, to redeem the soul of America. That was their motto, their focus, and their theme. Yet again, it is the soul of America that is in trouble. The United States of America, the land of the free, is by far the mass incarceration capital of the world. Think about that. The land of the free, the shining city on the hill, shackles more people than any land in the world. Nobody even comes close in the rates of incarceration or even in the sheer numbers of people incarcerated. It is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America that we are a nation that comprises 5% of the world's population and warehouses nearly 25% of the world's prison population is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America, that we lock up people awaiting trial and keep them there for weeks and months and years. Remember Khalif Browder, not because they pose a threat to society, but because they cannot afford to pay a bail bond, is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America. That we criminalize poverty and penalize people for being poor is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America. That we have a greater percentage of our black population in jails and prisons than did South Africa at the height of apartheid is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America. That in all of our large American cities, as many as half of the young black men are caught up somewhere in the matrix and social control of the criminal justice system, and that black men have been banished from our families. Devastating generations of our families is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America. These men, and increasingly women, then come out carrying the mark and stigma of convicted felon, ex-felon, and are therefore defined and confronted with all of the legalized barriers against which Martin Luther King Jr. and those who battled the old Jim Crow fought, including discrimination in housing, employment, voting, some professional licenses. In my own state of Georgia, you can't even get a barber's license, public benefits, and student loans. It is the new and improved Jim Crow. It is a scandal and a scar on the soul of America. Most of the black men in America's jails and prisons today are charged with nonviolent drug-related offenses. They are casualties in America's war on drugs. At least it was a war when the drug was crack, and the bodies were black and brown in places like Detroit, Baltimore, the south side of Chicago, South Central LA, certain communities in LA, in Atlanta. We had a war on drugs, the 80s and the 90s and beyond. But now that we are talking about opioids and meth, and the faces of the human tragedy are white and suburban, Suddenly we have a public health emergency, an opioid crisis. Two very different responses to essentially the same problem. Public health emergencies are addressed through doctors, public health officials, social workers, therapists, and clinics. Wars are prosecuted against enemy combatants who are either killed or become prisoners of war. In places as large as New York, entire communities may well experience daily the trauma of being subjected to stop and frisk, the tools of a de facto occupation in a democratic republic that makes claims to certain constitutional guarantees like presumed innocence, due process. In places as small as Ferguson, citizen protests are met by military tanks and weapons of war on civilian streets. The truth is that there are a whole lot of people across racial, religious, class, cultural, and generational lines who are self-medicating in the midst of an American crisis. The deep, aching spiritual void of a culture awash in the broken promises of an individualistic consumerist impulse of acquisition that even reduces relationships to transactions and short circuits the difficult but fulfilling work of real intimacy and the joy of genuine community. We're all entitled to our own opinion, but not our own facts. The data clearly show that people, black people and white people, use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. Yet black people are 12% of the general population and over 50% of the prison population. That's why my sister, Michelle Alexander, has persuasively argued that the mass incarceration of tens of thousands of black men for nonviolent drug-related offenses and the lifelong consequences that result are constituent parts of the new Jim Crow. Legally barred from the doors of entry to citizenship, symbolizing the right to vote, and denied access to ladders of opportunity and social upward mobility, she observes that those who have served their time in America's prisons or who plead guilty in exchange for little or no actual prison time are not part of a class, Alexander argues, but a permanent caste system. I agree. In theological terms, they are condemned to what I call eternal social damnation. Even in the face of heroic efforts to carve for oneself a path of redemption, ours is an exceedingly punitive system that routinely produces political pariahs and economic lepers, condemned in a very real sense to check a box on applications of employment and other applications reminiscent of the ancient biblical stigma, unclean. There is no clearer example of America's unfinished business with the project of racial justice than the 21st century caste system engendered by its prison industrial complex. Moreover, I submit that there is no more significant scandal belying the moral credibility and witness of the American churches than their conspicuous silence as this human catastrophe has unfolded now for more than 3 decades. To be sure, scores of American churches have prison ministries, and some even have reclamation ministries for formerly incarcerated individuals. Important work. But there is a vast difference between offering pastoral care and spiritual guidance to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and challenging in an organized way the public policies, laws, and policing practices that lead to the disproportionate incarceration of people of color in the first place. I submit that that is one of the most pressing moral issues of this moment. We need a national, multi-faith, multiracial movement to end the scourge of mass incarceration, the insatiable beast whose massive tentacles place black children in chokeholds and brown babies in cages on both sides of the border. But how do you build an effective social movement, particularly among church persons, when the primary subjects of its advocacy are those stigmatized by the pejorative label illegals, in the case of our Latinx sisters and brothers, subjected to draconian tactics of immigration enforcement, whether they are citizens or not? And how do you win public sympathy and support for, quote, convicted felons? It is one thing to stand up for Rosa Parks, who Martin Luther King Jr. called, quote, one of the most respected people in the Negro community. It is quite another to fight for the basic human dignity of persons whose entire humanity has been supplanted by a legal and moral stigma. In many instances, some may well bear real culpability for their condition. Indeed, this is part of the conundrum posed by racial bias in the criminal justice system. In a world where ordinary black people must still navigate every day the racial politics of respectability, bearing the burden of being, in the words of that old saying in the black community, a credit to the race, particular burden of an oppressed people. Those who find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system by that logic have not kept their side of the deal. If many outside of the African American community view these young black men and women who track through the courtrooms of every major American city every single day with fear and contempt, many within their own families and churches harbor feelings of disappointment, anger, and ambivalence. They are the ultimate outsiders, stigmatized for life as both black and criminal. Two words that have long been interchangeable in the Western moral imagination. 400 years after the arrival of more than 20 enslaved Africans in Jamestown, Virginia, the black body remains the central text in the narrative of a complicated story called America. For all who would understand who we Americans are and how we arrived, the black body is essential reading. There is no American wealth without reference to black people. Yet the black body is viewed essentially as a problem, sitting at the center of what Gunnar Myrdal characterized in 1944 as the American dilemma. 400 years later, formerly enslaved black bodies and branded black bodies and lynched black bodies and raped black bodies and segregated black bodies are now stopped, frisked, groped, searched, handcuffed, incarcerated, paroled, probated, released, but never emancipated black bodies. Like many, I have witnessed the human cost of this story and stigma, and I have felt this pain personally, experiencing it in my own family. I am the youngest of 7 boys in my family. That's a lot of boys. My brother Keith, who is the brother just above me, 5 years older than me, is serving time right now in a federal prison. He's been in several, but he spent most of the last 22 years in a prison in South Carolina that literally was a plantation. He was sentenced to life, that is his natural life, in 1997 as a first-time offender in a drug-related offense in which no one was killed and no one was physically hurt. In fact, because the entire crime scenario was created, concocted, and controlled by the federal authorities, no one even got high. In this operation, no actual drugs ever hit the streets, and none were removed from the streets. My brother was sentenced to life. He is a veteran of the First Gulf War and has appointed himself as a model prisoner, no easy feat amidst the challenges of prison life. Since his incarceration 22 years ago. Yet it is the stigma of color and criminality that makes his story not as uncommon as one might think. But no group is more stigmatized than those persons on death row. After years of steady decline and presumptive death by many criminologists, the death penalty reemerged as part of a conservative backlash in the years immediately following the civil rights movement. In a real sense, it is the final fail-safe of white supremacy. For the data clearly show that its use ensures that in the final analysis, the lives of white people are to be regarded as more valuable than the lives of black people. That is why the race of the victim, more than anything else, determines the likelihood that the punishment will be death by execution. And if the victim is white and the presumed perpetrator is African American, the symbolic power of condemning that cardinal trespass is every bit as important as ensuring that the actual African American who committed the offense is executed. That is the logic of Jim Crow. And that is still true decades after the era of lynching became exceedingly clear to me a few years ago during my public advocacy for death row inmate Troy Davis. By the time I met Troy Davis and became involved with his case, both as pastor to him and his family, and a public advocate for the sparing of his life, he had been on death row for nearly 20 years. Convicted in 1991 for the 1989 slaying of Savannah, Georgia police officer Mark Allen McPhail, 28-year-old man who certainly did not deserve to die. It was 2008, and we held the first of several rallies for Troy Davis at Atlanta's historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, where I am privileged to serve. By that time, Davis's case had already gained national and international attention and brought together unlikely allies in the struggle to save his life. The case embodied clearly all that is wrong with America's deployment of the death penalty, that even death penalty proponents like William Sessions, former head of the FBI, and Bob Barr, a conservative Georgia congressman with whom I disagree 99% of the time. Stood in agreement with the likes of President Jimmy Carter and Congressman John Lewis against the execution of Troy Davis. Why? Because the trial provided no physical evidence in support of Davis's conviction. No murder weapon, DNA evidence, or surveillance tapes were ever produced. And in a trial based largely on eyewitness testimony, 7 of the 9 witnesses supporting the prosecution's case recanted or materially changed their testimony. There was so much doubt surrounding this case that on 3 separate occasions, Davis's execution was stayed within minutes of his death. I remember on one occasion going on CNN as he was scheduled to die to say that it was a sad day in America, and before I could return back to my office, I got another call and had to return to CNN. Grateful that his life had been spared. And then one fall afternoon, I sat in a pastoral visit across from his cell as he reflected on his life, its meaning, and his hope that somehow his story might be a bridge to a better future and a larger good. We talked, we prayed, we even laughed a little. We sat silently. We said goodbye. 2 days later, I stood in a prison yard with his family and hundreds of others one fall night, September 21st, 2011, as Troy Davis was stretched out and strapped to a gurney bearing an eerie resemblance to a crucifix, and executed in my name as a citizen of the state of Georgia by lethal injection. In the years that I have continued to fight for Davis and others like him, and for the soul of a nation scarred by the scandal of mass incarceration, and for the lives of young black men like Trayvon Martin and young black women like Sandra Bland, tragically endangered and murdered by the stigma of blackness as criminality. I've often reminded myself that I preach each week in memory of a death row inmate convicted on trumped-up charges at the behest of religious authorities and executed by the state without the benefit of due process. The cross, the Roman Empire's method of execution, reserved for subversives, is a symbol of stigma and shame. Yet the early followers of Jesus embraced the scandal of the cross, calling it the power of God. To tell that story is to tell the story of stigmatized human beings. To embrace the cross is to bear witness to the truth and power of God, subverting human assumptions about truth and power, pointing beyond the tragic limits of a given moment toward the promise of the resurrection. It is to see what an imprisoned exile of a persecuted community saw as he captured in Scripture the vision and hope of a new heaven and a new earth. That is why I fight. That is why Ebenezer Baptist Church, spiritual home of Martin Luther King Jr., has been trying to find a way to faithfully and effectively bear witness to God's justice in the world. And so this past summer, we organized a national, multiracial, multi-faith conference focused on the collective work of dismantling mass incarceration by catalyzing the resources of people of faith and moral courage in a movement that operates at the local, state, and national levels. Our co-conveners were Auburn Theological Seminary in New York and the Temple, that's its name. It is the oldest Jewish congregation in Atlanta. Together we are at work now for the long haul, and we have 4 objectives. Number 1, to train and equip pastors, rabbis, imams, and other faith leaders and their teams with practical tools for addressing their ministries to mass incarceration as a social justice issue in their local setting. 2, to identify and coalesce around a strategic legislative agenda at the local, state, and national levels. 3, to organize an interfaith network of partners focused on abolishing mass incarceration. And 4, to lay the groundwork for the development of a new media strategy for reframing the public understanding of the prison industrial complex and its implications for public safety and quality of life. But this national effort, taken on in partnership with others, builds upon years of advocacy and activism, seeking to leverage our legacy for good work in the present rather than rest on the historic laurels of a glorious past. We at Ebenezer Church have been busy addressing our ministry, particularly over the last several years, to a criminal justice system that crushes the poor, in the incinerator of a biased system whose outcomes are too often more criminal than just. From time to time, we have gotten engaged as public advocates in certain cases. We have raised offerings and have partnered with celebrities like my good friend rapper T.I. and actor Mark Ruffalo, the Incredible Hulk, to bail poor people awaiting trial out of jail. And we raised our voices as part of a coalition of conscience that last spring successfully convinced the mayor and the council to end cash bail in the city of Atlanta. Moreover, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms has committed to closing the Atlanta City Jail and turning it into a youth center that invests in the future. But much of our work has been focused on expungements or record restrictions. In 2016, we came together with other Fulton County officials to organize and host our very first expungement clinic. It is a one-stop shop in the church's banquet hall that cleared the arrest records of hundreds of citizens who had been arrested but never convicted. Yet, like millions of Americans who have arrest records, they were either barred or limited in their employment options, rejected in their applications for housing, apartments, and other features of a prosperous and dignified life. These expungement events reduced what used to take 120 days to 1 day. And they've been emancipation moments for people looking for a second chance. I remember the very first one and the joy I felt as I walked into our sanctuary one Saturday morning and realized that almost everyone gathered in church that day had a record. But then it occurred to me that that's true every Sunday. None of us wants to be forever judged by our worst moment, and each of us has some record that cries out for grace and redemption. Sometime after the first event, I was sitting in the chair at the barbershop. You all must be asleep. I said I was sitting in the chair. At the barbershop. My barber was finishing my haircut. Don't worry about it. And I was rushing to get out of the chair to my next appointment when another patron whom I did not know walked up to me. And he said, "Rev, that was a great event y'all had." That's how we talk in the South. I said, "What event?" He said, "The expungement event." I politely said thank you, thinking he had seen it on the news. And I was trying, after all, to get to my next appointment. He said, "Rev, wait. You don't understand. You cleared my record." He had a bad check charge, some story about a bad check, and an ex-wife from 20 years ago. I didn't want to know the details. But I froze. He appeared to be in his late 50s, well-dressed, and he looked so respectable. He continued, "As a result of my record being restricted, I've got a better job. My income has gone up and my life is better." I congratulated him, shook his hand, and was headed for the door when he said, "Rev, wait. A young couple in my family had a baby that they did not have the means to raise. The baby was headed to foster care. Thank God for foster care parents, but quite often the outcomes of our foster care system are very poor. They are part of the prison pipeline. But he said to me, because I came to church and somebody cleared my record, I was able to adopt my great niece. The trajectory of 2 generations changed in one day. I am glad, but I am also sad and mad that they didn't tell me the truth in 9th grade civics. There I was taught that you were innocent until proven guilty, and if you were cleared and acquitted, you went on and enjoyed the rest of your life. But this brother had an arrest record. He was free, yet for 20 years he had been bound by the massive tentacles of our prison industrial complex. While helping people like him, it is that fundamental problem that we seek to address in our new movement in a nation where nearly 30% of adults, American adults, has a record. And now, armed with a faith kit that you can find at www.endingmassincarceration.com, and a wonderful documentary film put together by Judy Doctoroff, who's here tonight, and our partners at Public Square Media. We're teaching other congregations to do the same. People of faith and moral courage should lead the charge and embrace the challenge of saying to a failed system, "Let my people go." That is what God told Moses to tell Pharaoh. "Let my people go that they may worship me, liberate them from human bondage so that they may blossom and live lives of human flourishing, lives that give glory to God rather than to human systems." Moses had a speech impediment, yet God picked him. Moses had a record, yet God picked him in spite of his record. Or maybe God picked him because he had a record. The record shows that God has a record of using people with a record. Moses had a record. He slew an Egyptian. He killed a man, but God had more in store for him. Joseph had a record. Long before a Central Park case and a ruthless prosecutor, there was Potiphar's wife. Joseph was thrown in prison, but he held on to his dreams. You know the rest of the story. The 3 Hebrew boys had a record, and they were sentenced to death for an act of civil disobedience. Daniel was charged, convicted, and thrown in the lion's den. He had a record. John was imprisoned on an island called Patmos, the Rikers island of that day. There he saw a new heaven and a new earth. Jesus had a record. Not surprising, given his background, coming from where he came from. Born in a barrio called Bethlehem, smuggled as an undocumented immigrant into Egypt, raised in a ghetto called Nazareth, and yet he came preaching that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, to set at liberty the incarcerated, to preach the year of the Lord's freedom. They brought him up on trumped-up charges, convicted him without the benefit of due process, marched him up Golgotha's hill, executed him on a Roman cross, buried him in a borrowed tomb. But he was so powerful that he turned the scandal of the cross into an enduring symbol of victory over evil and injustice. And his movement was so contagious that he got off the cross and got in our hearts. He is my Redeemer and Liberator. And in his name and in the name of all that is good and justice and righteous and true, we must all stand together across faith traditions, across racial lines, stand together, fight together, walk together, organize together, vote together, pray together, stay together, and say together, "Let my people go."
I was young at the time, and I made a lot of mistakes, you know.
Some people told me, oh, it's 30 years ago, who cares? But I cared because that was my name, that was my integrity.
Regardless of what my certifications say, regardless of what my degrees say, everything is fine until they start doing the background check. And if it's something that they see they don't like, you know, they're not gonna hire you.
Record restriction is the mirror of our times, reflecting the unresolved racism and economic inequity that still exists in our society.
They will leave today with the order to seal their record, and they will leave today with the clean GCIC to show that their record has been restricted.
I believe that this records restrictions project is geared to give people an opportunity to get jobs, to be employed, and take care of their families.
What we're hoping to do ultimately through these expungements of the records of individuals is to raise the conversation about the terrible public policy decision that we as a country have made in the last 50 years. When we should have invested in people, we invested in prisons.
The Bible says in Hebrew, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. And it's a reminder to us that there is nothing as important as the pursuit of justice.
For the first time in 30 years, someone said to me, yes, we can help you.
And I can just tell you from the reaction that I've seen from the people today, I mean, we had people that were in tears because this was so important to them. And for any elected official in any community, if that's not important to you, then you're in the wrong business.
Professor Stern and Reverend Warnock up to the front. Let's thank Reverend Warnock one more time for that wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Good evening. Can you all hear me? It's such an honor to be in conversation with you. You may want to talk about Jubilee, which I think is my favorite thing to talk about.
Yes.
But I have 4 really thoughtful questions from some students that I'm hoping I can translate for you. Okay, so as a Black educator growing up in an inner city and being affected by mass incarceration, I can admit that I have been unfortunately desensitized to America's normalizing the control of Black bodies. How do we empower students from inner cities, like South Side of Chicago and Detroit, to have hope when I too am hopeless at times? How do I help students understand and acknowledge the systems of mass incarceration and the crisis to dismantle the system while still empowering said hope?
Yeah. Well, first of all, where's Judy Doctoroff? Are you here? Where is she? Stand up, Judy. This is Judy Doctoroff of Public Square Media. They put together the documentary that you saw tonight. And I do want to send folks to endingmassincarceration.com so you can learn more about our work. I think the fact that this student is asking the question, even while saying, you know, I'm worried that I've become desensitized to this normalizing of that which is not normal. The fact that you are asking the question gives me a lot of hope and says to me, no, you haven't become desensitized. The fact that you're worried about it. Now, if you weren't worried about it, then I'd be worried. But the fact that you're raising the question suggests that there is something in your moral antenna that says we can't tolerate this, we cannot accept this as normal. I do think that is I think that's something that oppressed people always have to struggle with. I'm a post-civil rights generation baby. I was born a year after Dr. King's death, 1969. So I'm not the youngster anymore, 50 this year, it's a big deal. But because I serve as senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and I see one of our members, John Brown, sitting back there, a graduate of HDS, because I sit in the pulpit where I serve, I have the benefit of knowing that every Black person in America, every single one, over the age of 60, marched with Dr. King. Right? Everybody. In fact, there are not enough streets in America just for the Black people. You all need to loosen up. I know it's hard. This is a tough crowd. Who told you all had to be so, I mean, there are not enough streets in America for the black people who march without the king. Why is that? It's because if you live through that period, black or white, whoever you are, you cannot help but ask yourself, because now you have the benefit of hindsight, what was I doing? And what was I saying about the folk who were out in the street? And I think I got a feeling that people kind of edit that record for themselves. Because as he used to say, they woke up and they realized that they either walked or slept through a revolution. And so I'm clear that 50 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, our children, our grandchildren are going to ask us, what were you doing while this human rights nightmare unfolded on your watch? It's hard for us to imagine, but it must be true because it lasted so long. People had all kinds of justifications for why segregation made sense, for why chattel slavery made sense. It's just a normal rhythm of things. And people have all kinds of moral and ethical and legal justifications for why it makes sense for us to have this massive prison system. And I kind of worked at it, and it's something that I'm still thinking through. I do believe that the infrastructure has created its own ideology. Is one more morphing and mutation in this tragic story that began in 1619, that the system of incarceration itself is so massive that's why that danger is in place, that people kind of feel like, well, you can't imagine something different. And I'm daring all of us, especially young people, who always saved the movement. Birmingham wouldn't have turned out the way it did if it weren't for high school students, middle school students, and in some cases, elementary school students. I'm counting on all of us, but particularly our young sisters and brothers, to imagine a different future.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. The next one is, in light of the recent passing of Amendment 4 in the state of Florida, the public referendum that restored voting rights for approximately 1.4 million people with criminal records, what role should the church play in motivating and organizing these returning citizens to vote?
We should be working hard to get returning citizens, and that's the right term, returning citizens. I want to begin to challenge us to think about how the words that we use. You call somebody an ex-felon. I mean, you think about that. So they're defined always by that. We ought to encourage people to vote. In fact, if you really want to start some stuff, we ought to be creating some precincts inside of some of the county jails. There are people there who haven't been convicted of anything. And if you really want to stir up some stuff, let's start a movement and get the folks who are in the county jails registered to vote. I was with Reverend Jackson last week, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and I think they've done this already in the Cook County Jail. They've created a precinct. And they've helped the folk who are there to see that they have a reason to vote and to be engaged. I'm chairman of the New Georgia Project, which was started by my friend Stacey Abrams in 2014. I was a spokesperson when we started it. We've registered over 300,000 new voters and really changed what's possible in Georgia. So stay tuned as we keep fighting the good fight. Part of the reason I'm engaged on this issue of the criminal justice system is that it touches on so many issues. So I'm glad that question was asked. You know, say, why are you so focused on mass incarceration? There are a lot of issues. Name your issue. I'm almost willing to guarantee you that this issue of mass incarceration touches it. Whether it's voting, say, well, the answer is education. Well, think about the school to prison pipeline, which begins in high school, no younger than that. Middle school, no younger than that. Elementary school, no younger than that. Pull up a study by Walter Gilliam, professor at Yale University, in which he shows that young black boys find themselves in the gaze of guilt, a problem, as young as preschool. There's a deep kind of visceral bias. And they literally had preschool teachers, they put 4 kids, 2 white and 2 black, male and female, at a table and asked the teacher to tell them when, if there's a problem, kind of just look in that direction. They had these goggles on. And they asked the teachers when there was a problem, and first they asked them, when do you think you noticed a problem? And the teachers confessed to what they thought was a gender bias. Kind of boys will be boys. But they were very focused on the black boy sitting at the table. In fact, none of the kids were causing any problems. And the reason we know is because all the kids were actors. And I want to invite you to go and check out the study at Yale University. And they were focused that this kind of gaze and this issue starts as early as preschool. That's the ways in which I think the infrastructure creates its own ideology and mindset. And we've got a lot of work to do to free ourselves of that.
Even though people have been granted the right to vote in Florida, they have to pay off all their debts. And
right,
I've worked in the prison system for years. None of my inmates could afford the fines that had grown over time and multiplied. And I wonder if, as part of some of the religious institutions, if there could be some work done to take up collections. These 1.4 million people can't automatically have their voter rights restored because the Republicans have now stipulated that although the general public wants to give them their rights back, their voting rights, if they don't pay off their fines, and many of them can't, they will not be allowed to vote. And I think Florida is also an important state for the next election.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but it makes my blood boil. Because, in America, we have noisy, rambunctious arguments in the democratic space about guns and butter, about what to fund, about public policy. And those arguments should be noisy, and they should be rambunctious so that we can have a nonviolent democratic process. But at the end of the argument, we've got a powerful thing that says the people have spoken. But what we witnessed over the last few years is an attack on democracy itself. And the carceral system is part of that, is a tool in that arsenal. So I don't know. I'd be happy to talk to my colleagues in Florida. I don't know what it would cost to pay all of those fines. But churches and mosques and temples, that might be, if we did it, for me, it would be a way then of getting the microphone to raise the question. Us simply paying the beast for what shouldn't be the case in the first place is not the answer. we ought to push back. If we did some payment, it would be to draw attention to the issue and say this, it's sort of like we're bailing people out of jail, but our ultimate goal is to get rid of cash bail. So it's a poll tax. It's voter suppression. Our democracy is being hijacked, and we have to take it back. So we've got to keep fighting the good fight, not just in Florida, but in Alabama and Georgia and a whole lot of other places.
Thank you. You touched a little bit on this. It leads well into the next question. There are so many urgent and important problems in this world. What are your thoughts about how to work for an end to incarceration and also for a solution to climate change, for example? Certainly there's overlap among these urgent problems, but they are dealt with primarily as separate issues. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's something I'm working through. You should come to my third lecture, whoever asked that. No, it's my fourth lecture. So I've made a commitment to talk about 4 issues that I think speak to the state of the soul of America. And so tonight I talked about mass incarceration. Next month I'll be focused on voting and democracy and voter suppression. In the spring I'm doing a lecture on poverty. And last but not least, I'll be talking about the existential threat of climate change and the ways in which people who are traditionally in the civil rights movement need to pay more attention to climate change. And the folk who have been engaged in the climate movement that has for too long been suburban and white and middle class need to pay attention to civil rights issues and the intersectionality of those issues. Poor people and people of color, people who benefit the least from the revenues and the technology that create climate disasters, are impacted the most. High incidences of asthma, race is the clearest indicator of where a toxic dump will be located. So all of these things are connected. Freddie Gray in Baltimore, you remember that case? Freddie Gray, who died in the custody of the police and became one of those flashpoints for this issue about encounters between the police and ordinary citizens. His story didn't begin there. Freddie Gray grew up in Baltimore, where I was a pastor for almost 5 years. He was a victim of environmental hazards in the built environment. Lead poisoning in substandard housing in a country where we have known for decades what lead poisoning does and how it leads to behavioral issues in the classroom and learning difficulties. And then so then he becomes part of the prison pipeline. So these civil rights issues, human rights issues, climate change, both in the natural world and in the built environment, are all part of this larger issue that speaks to the soul of America. Flint, Michigan, all of these years later, the problem's still not corrected. There was another Fred Gray. Fred Gray was Dr. King's lawyer in Montgomery. Dr. King got in trouble. Fred Gray, who's still alive, brilliant lawyer, pushed through Jim Crow segregation, got his law degree. He would defend Dr. King when he was arrested. Fred Gray fought against the signs in front of water fountains that said white and colored. Freddie Gray, Baltimore, decades later, never saw or experienced such signs. but he died. And poor children in Flint, Michigan are being crushed in a world where there are no signs in front of water fountains that say white and colored. But the water is literally poisoning our children. And so these things are connected, and that's the work that all of us are called to do. It's not one or the other. It's both and.
Thank you. Finally, do you believe in prison abolition, and what is your dream for the future? Two good ones.
That's a conversation I'm having with people that I know who are engaged in this work. I don't identify myself as a prison abolitionist. I've got friends and colleagues who do. I just think I'm for the dismantling of the carceral state, this massive infrastructure where prison literally becomes the answer to a whole range of issues, including mental health. I think if we addressed ourselves to the sickness of America, there would be a lot fewer people, a whole lot fewer people, whom we might feel the need to protect the society from in that particular way and through that mechanism. So I don't necessarily get too caught up in the nomenclature. I think it's a healthy conversation, an important debate. But I imagine and I dream about a world in which one's zip code doesn't determine your lot in life, and your family's income doesn't determine your outcome. That's the kind of world that I dream about, and all of us are called to do that work. I live in Atlanta, a city that is very proud. We call ourselves the city too busy to hate. We're proud of the fact that we're the home of Martin Luther King Jr. And some call Atlanta the Black Mecca because of incredible examples of achievement and leadership, large Black middle class, professional class, leadership class. But there's another side of Atlanta's story. It too bears the burden and the contradiction of two Americas. Over the last decade, on too many occasions, we've been number one or number two. In terms of the largest wealth gap of any metropolitan area in the country. Now they've got a lot more billionaires and multimillionaires, say, in San Francisco and the Bay Area and New York and other places. But Atlanta's been number one, number two, largest wealth gap in the country. Black kid growing up in certain communities of Atlanta where there are these amazing, on the one hand, amazing stories and historically Black colleges and universities, Black people doing well, people like me doing really well. But a Black child born in certain zip codes in Atlanta, their chances in terms of the data of getting out of poverty and into another place are near zero. So these are larger structural issues. Race is certainly part of it. But if we're serious about correcting it, all of us have got to put our shoulders to the wheel in different ways and ask ourselves some tough questions. And so I dream of a world where, again, where regardless of your zip code, race, gender, sexual identity, or sexual orientation, your class, that you can embrace possibilities for human flourishing. I think that's what God meant, or that's what the text meant when it records that God said to Moses, "Let my people go so that they may worship me, that they will not have to bow down to systems of oppression, but they might embrace a world that resists resists injustice. It's important for us to resist injustice because injustice inflates the self-understanding of the oppressor. It injures the soul of the oppressed, and it insults the sovereignty of God. And so for me, this is moral and spiritual work that declares that our God is God in the heaven above and the earth below, and that God invites all of us to a wonderful banquet of human flourishing.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. If someone in the audience would like to pose one.
Are you kidding? That was my benediction.
Well,
I'm just kidding.
There you go.
Sir?
Thank you. I'm a Baptist preacher too, so I can.
Good to see you.
I recognize. It's good to see you as well. I've been reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, just recently came out. And so I was sort of struck by the question of what your hope might be for the future. Also thinking about the question of whether or not you were a prison abolitionist. I'm not trying to emphasize that question, but thinking about the carceral state, moving it from a system that is non-racist to a system that is more anti-racist, what would you imagine that type of system to look like in terms of the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to be honest about the ways in which race and racism plays itself out in every level, at every level of the system. And I think many Americans are still not ready to be honest about that, to have that conversation. That what the disparity that we're witnessing is not an accident. It's not, in some sense, it's not a failed system because the system is doing what it was organized to do. It is one more iteration of this age-old problem whom we mark this year with, in some ways, even though it's long, it's more complicated than that, by this 400th year. So this anti-racism calls all of us, I think, to interrogate the system, to interrogate basic assumptions about guilt and innocence. I mean, if we were really focused on drugs, how is it, if we're serious about drugs and the scourge of drugs and the war on drugs, I will be convinced that we're serious about that when I see one pharmaceutical executive get arrested. Just one. I mean, we now have the goods. We know that they knew what they were doing. And, you know, why is that disparity? Why does Eric Garner have his life choked out of him in broad daylight on a New York City street for selling loose cigarettes? And Wall Street bankers literally almost took the whole economy over the cliff, and not one banker went to jail. So you cannot talk about that without respect to wealth and power and race. And I think that's an important distinction. I think if we just focus on non-races in a country with the history that we have, if we just focus on being non-racial, I think that bleeds into a kind of uncritical, neutral position. And you can't be neutral when you're fighting white supremacy. You got to fight against it. And so thank you for that important distinction. That's the work that we're called to do.
I'm sorry to cut our conversation off. I hope you all will join us for a reception in the memorial room right off the sanctuary here. One of the themes of our work and our worship at the Memorial Church this year is the practice of pilgrimage. We've been thinking about, how do we move our bodies ethically through the world together? And what claim do the journeys of others make on our own? And where are we going? Chaos or community? We're so grateful to you for pointing us in the right direction tonight and for being a light to our path. We look forward so much to the next 3 lectures and hope very much we'll be welcoming you all back on November 20th for Reverend Warnock's discussion of voting rights and voter suppression. To close us out tonight, with just tremendous thanks to you both, to Professor Stern as well, and for the great questions from your students. I'd like to leave us with a blessing, an 11th century pilgrim blessing for people who are about to set out on their journey. May God be for us, and we for one another, a defense in emergency, a harbor in shipwreck, shade in the heat, light in the storm, a staff on the slippery slope, joy amid suffering, consolation in sadness, safety in adversity, caution in prosperity, so that we may safely arrive where we are boldly going. Amen.
Thank you so much.